Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are fates worse than death, and in the Imperium of man, those fates are not reserved for enemies or invaders. They are the birthright of every single human being born beneath the cold, indifferent gaze of the Golden Throne. We talk so often about the wars of the 41st Millennium, the clash of titans and the roar of bolter fire, the heroic last stands and the glorious charges into the teeth of alien hordes. We celebrate the Space Marines and their chapters, whilst we marvel at the might of titans striding across scorched battlefields, and we speak in hushed tones of the God Emperor who sits upon his throne in eternal vigil. But in all of this, in all the grand spectacle and the terrible majesty of warfare on a galactic scale, we forget something. We forget the people, not the warriors, not the heroes, not the saints or the generals or the primarchs. We forget the ordinary, unremarkable, desperately fragile human beings who make up the overwhelming majority of the Imperium's population. The ones who will never hold a bolter, who will never see a space marine in the flesh, who will never know anything beyond the stinking, suffocating confines of whatever hab block or factory floor they were born into. And when we do finally turn our attention to these forgotten billions, what we find is something far more disturbing than any Xenos threat or demonic incursion. But because the most terrible thing about the Imperium of man is not what it does to its enemies, it is what it does to its own people. Every single day, across 1,000,000 worlds, the Imperium grinds its citizens beneath a heel of iron and adamantium, consuming their bodies, their minds, their very souls in the name of survival. And the worst part, the truly horrifying part, is that it has convinced those same citizens that this is not merely acceptable, it is holy. So tonight, settle in, and let the weight of the galaxy settle around your shoulders like a heavy cloak, because we are going to walk through the Imperium of man together, not as heroes or warriors, but as ordinary people. We are going to see what they see, breathe what they breathe, eat what they eat. We are going to understand the true horror of life under the most oppressive regime in human history, a regime so vast and so ancient that it has forgotten what mercy even means, if it ever knew at all. And maybe, just maybe, by the time we are finished, you will understand why the tagline of this universe is not a promise of hope or triumph. It is simply this: in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But for the citizens of the Imperium, there is something worse than war. There is the peace that comes after it. There is the everyday, grinding, soul-crushing existence of being a number in a ledger, a cog in a machine so vast that no single mind can comprehend it. There is the knowledge that you were born to serve, to suffer, and to die, and that your death will mean nothing more than a minor statistical adjustment in some dusty archive that no one will ever read. This is the Imperium of man, and this is what it does to the people it claims to protect. Before we go further, I want you to do something for me. I want you to think about the most mundane moment of your day. Maybe it was waking up this morning in a bed that was reasonably warm and reasonably clean. Maybe it was pouring yourself a glass of water from a tap and drinking it without wondering what invisible chemicals were dissolving into your bloodstream with every sip. Maybe it was stepping outside and feeling sunlight on your face, real sunlight, the unfiltered light of a yellow sun falling through clean air onto skin that has never been scarred by industrial pollutants. Hold on to that feeling. Because for the vast, overwhelming majority of human beings alive in the 41st millennium, those simple experiences are as alien and unimaginable as the surface of a demon world. The citizens of the Imperium do not wake in beds. They wake in stacked bunks, in hab blocks, so cramped that they can reach out and touch the person sleeping beside them, above them, and below them without stretching. They do not drink clean water. They drink recycled fluid that has passed through filtration systems so old and so degraded that the concept of purity is a theoretical abstraction, and they will never, ever feel sunlight on their faces. Most imperial citizens are born, live, and die without ever seeing the sky. That is where we begin. Not with war, not with heroes, not with the grand struggle of civilizations, but with the quiet, crushing, suffocating ordinariness of life in the Imperium. Out with the slow realization that every day is the same as the last, that tomorrow will be the same as today, and that this endless, grinding sameness is not a temporary condition to be endured, but the permanent, unalterable reality of your existence from cradle to grave. And the grave, for most imperial citizens, comes far sooner than it should. Let us begin in the places where the vast majority of imperial citizens spend every moment of their short, brutal lives. Let us begin in the hive cities. Now picture, if you can, a mountain. Not a natural mountain of stone and earth and snow, but a mountain built by human hands over the course of 10,000 years. A mountain of rockcrete and adamantium, of rusted iron and corroded steel, reaching so high into the sky that its upper levels pierce the cloud layer and look down upon the world below as though from orbit. Now imagine that this mountain is hollow. Imagine that every square meter of its interior is crammed with humanity, but packed so tightly that the concept of personal space is a luxury that only the wealthiest can afford. Imagine that this structure houses not thousands of people, not millions, but billions. 10 billion, perhaps. 100 billion in the most extreme cases. All of them living, working, breeding and dying within walls that most of them will never see the outside of. This is a hive city. And across the Imperium of man, there are approximately 32,380 worlds classified as hive worlds, each one bearing anywhere from 5 to 20 of these monstrous structures upon its scarred and poisoned surface. The thing you need to understand about hive cities is that they were not always like this. In the ancient past, during the age of technology, these arcologies were marvels of engineering. They were designed to allow vast populations to live together in advanced societies without damaging the planetary environment. They were self-sustaining ecosystems in their own right, all carefully balanced and meticulously maintained, places where humanity could thrive without destroying the world that supported them. But that was a long time ago. The age of strife shattered those careful balances. The technologies that kept the hives in harmony with their environments were lost or corrupted. And over the 10 millennia since the founding of the Imperium, these once magnificent structures have become something very different. They have become prisons, but not physical prisons with bars and locks, though those certainly exist within them. They are prisons of circumstance, of birth, of the crushing weight of a social hierarchy so rigid and so ancient that it might as well be a law of nature. In a hive city, your life is determined by altitude. The higher you live, the better your existence. At the very top of the hive, in the soaring spires that reach above the clouds, the nobility dwell in luxury that would make the ancient kings of old earth weep with envy. They breathe clean, filtered air. They eat real food, grown in hydroponic gardens or imported from agri-worlds at tremendous expense. They have access to rejuvenate treatments that can extend their lives for centuries, medical care that can repair almost any injury, and security forces that keep the teeming masses far below from ever troubling their perfumed halls. At the spires are places of beauty and culture, of art and music, and all the finer things that civilization can produce. Some nobles have never set foot below the cloud line. Some have never seen the sun obscured by the perpetual smog that blankets the lower levels. They live their entire lives in a world of artificial light and recycled privilege, blissfully ignorant of the suffering that supports their every comfort. Below the spires, the upper hive houses the administrators, the guildmasters, on the merchant princes and the upper echelons of imperial bureaucracy. Life here is not luxurious by the standards of the nobility above, but it is comfortable. There is adequate food, clean water, reliable power, and a reasonable expectation that you will not be murdered in your bed by a gang of desperate underhivers. The people of the upper hive work hard, certainly, but they work in offices and counting houses, in well-lit manufactoria and organized commercial districts. They can afford small luxuries, a bottle of decent amasec, a hab unit with more than one room, perhaps even a window that looks out upon something other than another wall. But the upper hive is a thin layer, a veneer of civilization painted over the seething mass of humanity below. Because below the upper hive lies the vast, sprawling, endlessly noisy and impossibly crowded expanse of the mid-hive. And this is where the true nature of imperial life reveals itself. In the mid-hive, where billions of people live and work in conditions that would be considered intolerable by any reasonable standard. The hab blocks are enormous communal structures, each one housing thousands of families in tiny units stacked one atop another, like cells in a honeycomb. Privacy is a fantasy. Silence is an impossibility. The constant hum of machinery, the rumble of industrial processes, the ceaseless murmur of too many voices in too small a space. Yet these sounds become the background radiation of existence, so ever-present that the people who live here cannot imagine what quiet sounds like. The air in the mid-hive is thick with pollutants. The filtration systems that once kept the atmosphere breathable have been patched and repaired and jury-rigged so many times over the millennia that they function at only a fraction of their original capacity. Every breath carries a cocktail of industrial chemicals, recycled gases, and the biological waste products of billions of human beings living in close quarters. Respiratory diseases are endemic. Life expectancy in the mid-hive is a fraction of what it is in the spires above. But nobody tracks that statistic. Nobody cares. The people of the mid-hive work. That is their function, their purpose, their entire reason for existing in the eyes of the Imperium. They work in manufactoria so vast that no single person has ever seen the whole extent of them. Our enormous factory complexes that produce everything from laser guns to boot leather, from tank treads to the ration bars that feed the Astra Militarum's endless regiments. They work 16-hour shifts, sometimes longer, in conditions that would kill an unaugmented human within a few years. The machinery they operate is ancient and poorly maintained, its original specifications lost to time and neglect. As industrial accidents are so common that they are not even reported unless they shut down production. A worker crushed by a malfunctioning press, a technician electrocuted by faulty wiring, an entire shift poisoned by a chemical leak. These are not tragedies in the mid-hive. They are simply the cost of doing business. And below the mid-hive, below even the deepest factory levels and the most decrepit hab blocks, there lies the underhive. If the mid-hive is grim and the upper hive is merely dull, or the underhive is something out of a nightmare. The underhive is where the refuse of the hive city accumulates, both material and human. It is a vast, labyrinthine wilderness of collapsed tunnels, abandoned infrastructure, and toxic waste. The rule of law does not extend here. The Adeptus Arbites, the Imperium's enforcers, rarely venture into the underhive unless they are hunting a particularly dangerous fugitive. And even then, they go in force and do not linger. But what passes for order in the underhive is maintained by gangs, cults, and petty warlords who rule their small territories with whatever violence they can muster. The people who live in the underhive are those who have fallen through every safety net the hive provides, which is to say, almost no safety net at all. They are the unemployable, the criminal, the mutant, the mad. They survive on whatever they can scavenge, steal, or kill for. Many of them have never seen natural light. And many of them have never eaten food that was not recycled from the waste of the levels above. Some of them are so far removed from normal human society that they have developed their own languages, their own religions, their own twisted cultures that bear only the vaguest resemblance to anything that might be called civilization. And yet, the underhive serves a purpose. Like everything in the Imperium, even its most wretched corners have been bent to the service of the state. Or the underhive breeds hardship, and hardship breeds fighters. When the Imperium needs soldiers for its endless wars, when the Astra Militarum demands its tithe of flesh, the underhive provides. The gangers and the scavengers and the desperate survivors of the deep dark are scooped up by press gangs and conscription drives, given a lasgun and a uniform, and shipped off-world to die on some battlefield they have never heard of, fighting an enemy they cannot comprehend, aid for an emperor they have never seen and never will. The underhive is not a failure of the imperial system. It is a feature. It is a factory for producing expendable human beings, and it works exactly as intended. This is the reality of life in a hive city. Not the glory of the spires or the drama of gang warfare, but the slow, grinding, everyday horror of billions of people living lives of quiet desperation in a structure that was designed to be efficient, not humane. The Imperium does not see these people as individuals. It sees them as resources, as raw material, as inputs in a vast equation of production and consumption that spans the entire galaxy. And if a few billion of them die from toxic air or industrial accidents, or the simple crushing weight of poverty and despair, that is an acceptable loss. The equation does not change. The production targets must be met. The tithes must be paid. The machine must keep turning. But consider the daily routine of an ordinary mid-hive worker on a world like Necromunda or Armageddon. They wake, if you can call it waking, in a hab unit barely large enough to stand in, a metal box with a sleeping pallet, a water spigot, and nothing else. There is no morning ritual, no preparation of breakfast, no moment of quiet reflection before the day begins. The work siren screams and you move, because if you do not move, you are docked pay, and if you are docked enough pay, yet you cannot afford even the meager ration chits that stand between you and starvation. You join the flow of bodies in the corridor, pressed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others, all of them wearing the same grey coveralls, all of them moving in the same direction, all of them wearing the same expression of blank, defeated endurance. The manufactorum floor is a cathedral of industry, its ceiling lost in smoke and shadow, at its walls vibrating with the ceaseless pounding of machines that have been running for centuries. The noise alone would be enough to drive an unaccustomed person mad within hours, a constant pulsing roar that penetrates the skull and settles into the bones like a second heartbeat. You cannot hear yourself think. You cannot hear someone shouting from 3 meters away. The workers communicate through hand signals, through lip reading, through the primitive language of gesture and expression that develops naturally in environments where speech is impossible. Your station is a press, or a lathe, or a welding rig, or one of 1,000 other pieces of equipment whose original designation and purpose has long since been forgotten. You know how to operate it because you were taught by the person who had it before you, who was taught by the person before them, who was taught by the person before them. A chain of knowledge stretching back through generations of workers who lived and died at this same station, doing this same job. You do not understand how the machine works. You do not know what it makes. You know only the sequence of actions that must be performed, the rhythm of levers and switches and feeds that keeps the production line moving, and you perform them over and over and over again for 16 hours without rest, without variation, without thought. While the accidents happen almost casually, a press comes down a fraction of a second too early, and a hand is crushed to pulp. A welding rig misfires and sends a shower of molten metal across an unprotected face. A conveyor belt snags a loose sleeve and drags a worker into the machinery, and by the time anyone notices, there is nothing left to recover. The bodies, what remains of them, are collected by the shift overseers and sent to the corpse guilds for processing. A replacement worker is assigned to the station. The production line does not stop. It cannot stop. To stop the line is a crime punishable by flogging or worse, and the foremen who manage the shift know that their own welfare depends on meeting the daily quotas set by the guildmasters above them, who answer to the planetary governor, who answers to the administratum, who answers to the tithes, which answer to the war. And at the end of the shift, or when the siren screams again and the flow of bodies reverses, the worker returns to their hab unit, collects their ration chit, and joins the queue at the nearest distribution point. The queue is long. It is always long. You stand in it for an hour, 2 hours, 3, shuffling forward in tiny increments while the smell of whatever is being dispensed today drifts down the line, a smell that is neither appetizing nor revolting, but simply present, the olfactory equivalent of the color gray. But when you reach the front, a servitor hands you your ration, a bar or a bowl of paste, and you eat it standing because there is nowhere to sit. And then you return to your hab unit and lie on your pallet and wait for the siren to scream again. This is not a bad day. This is every day. This is the entire life of billions of human beings, from the moment they are old enough to work until the moment they are too broken to continue, at which point they are discarded with the same indifference that the manufactorum shows toward a worn-out gear or a burnt-out circuit. There is no retirement in the lower hive. There is no pension, no social safety net, no comfortable old age surrounded by grandchildren and memories of a life well lived. When you can no longer work, you are finished. You drift downward, level by level, until you reach the underhive where you will die, and where your body will be collected and processed and fed back into the system that consumed your entire life. Some might argue that this is simply the cost of maintaining a galaxy-spanning empire in an era of constant warfare, that the resources do not exist to provide comfort and dignity to every citizen when the very survival of the species is at stake. And there is a kernel of truth to that argument, a cold, hard, pragmatic kernel that the Imperium has used to justify 10,000 years of institutional cruelty. But the argument falls apart when you look at the spires, when you look up and see the palaces and the gardens and the imported luxuries and the rejuvenate clinics of the nobility gleaming above the smog like stars above a polluted sea. The resources exist. They are simply not shared. The suffering of the lower hive is not a necessary sacrifice. It is a choice, made by those who have the power to make it, and maintained by a system that ensures those with power never have to confront the consequences of their choices. And speaking of tithes, that brings us to perhaps the most fundamental way in which the Imperium extracts value from its citizens. Not through taxation in the way we might understand it, but through a system of tribute so vast and so demanding that it reaches into every corner of every world in the Emperor's domain. As it is called the Imperial Tithe, and it is the lifeblood of the Imperium. It is also one of the greatest instruments of oppression ever devised. The Imperial Tithe is, at its core, a simple concept. Every world in the Imperium must contribute to the survival of the whole. This contribution takes many forms depending on the nature of the world in question. An agri-world might be expected to produce food, of vast quantities of grain and livestock to be shipped across the stars to feed the teeming billions of hive worlds and forge worlds that cannot feed themselves. A mining world contributes raw materials, ores and minerals dragged from the earth to be refined and manufactured into the weapons and vehicles of war. A forge world contributes manufactured goods, the products of its mighty manufactoria destined for the hands of soldiers and the hulls of warships. But the tithe is not limited to material goods. Far from it. Among the most important contributions that any world can make is a tithe of flesh. Living human beings, gathered up and shipped off-world to serve the Imperium in whatever capacity is required. This can mean recruits for the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, those endless regiments of ordinary men and women who form the backbone of the Imperium's military. As every world with a sufficient population is expected to provide 1/10 of its total military force to the Guard, trained, equipped, and ready for deployment. And the standards are exacting. It is a capital offense for a planetary governor to supply substandard soldiers, to provide insufficient numbers, or to send troops that lack proper uniforms, sufficient training, or appropriate levels of genetic purity. Think about what that means for a moment. 1/10 of a world's military force, every time the tithe is called. On a heavily militarized world like Cadia was before its fall, where the birth rate was said to be synonymous with the recruitment rate, this might be a manageable burden. But on a world that is already struggling to maintain its own defenses, that is already stretched thin by the demands of local threats and internal unrest, the loss of 1/10 of its fighting strength can be devastating. And the tithe does not care. The tithe is not interested in local circumstances or extenuating factors. The tithe is a number in a ledger, and that number must be met, regardless of the cost. The consequences of failure are severe, even by the Imperium's unforgiving standards. Failure to deliver the imperial tithe is not treated as an administrative shortcoming or a temporary difficulty. It is treated as an act of rebellion. Even the slightest breach in protocol, the most minor discrepancy in the numbers, it can result in the execution of the planetary governor and a swift, thorough, and often violent regime change. The Imperium does not send accountants to sort out the confusion. It sends soldiers. It sends inquisitors. It sends the full, terrible weight of imperial authority crashing down upon a world that has failed in its duty. And it does not particularly care whether that failure was the result of deliberate defiance or simple incompetence. And the truly horrifying thing is that the system that administers this tithe, the Adeptus Administratum, is itself so vast and so incompetent that errors are not merely possible, they are inevitable. Rounding errors and misspellings in the Administratum's endless records have resulted in worlds being declared traitors by accident. Entire regiments have been sentenced to death posthumously because of clerical mistakes. The bureaucracy that determines whether a world lives or dies, whether its people are rewarded or punished, is so bloated and so dysfunctional that whole departments have been lost and forgotten within its own structure. Entire divisions of adepts continue to diligently carry out the roles their departments were founded for, even after those departments have become completely obsolete, because to abandon their posts would be a greater crime than wasting their entire lives on meaningless work. The Administratum operates on a scale that defies comprehension. Billions of officials on Terra alone are constantly carrying out population censuses, calculating tithes, recording and archiving information, and performing the million other tasks necessary to keep the Imperium running. And they do all of this using methods that are, by any rational standard, absurdly outdated. The primary method of record keeping is vellum, actual physical parchment, because it appeals to the dogmatic values and traditionalism of the organization. But vellum is said to be the 7th largest import to Terra by sheer weight, consumed in vast quantities by the ravenous jaws of the bureaucracy. The Administratum is aware that electronic methods would be more efficient. It does not care. Tradition is more important than efficiency. Protocol is more important than results. The form is more important than the substance. And so the imperial tithe grinds on, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. But worlds are stripped of their resources, their people, their very capacity for self-sufficiency, all to feed the insatiable hunger of an imperium that is always at war, always in need, always demanding more. The citizens who bear this burden have no say in the matter. They have no representation, no voice, no mechanism for appeal. Citizenship in the Imperium confers no rights, only responsibilities. You are not a person in the eyes of the Administratum. You are a line item, as a resource to be allocated, a number to be balanced against other numbers in an equation that you will never see and could not understand even if you did. There is a particular cruelty in the way the tithe interacts with the fragility of interstellar travel. The Imperium's communications and logistics depend entirely on warp travel, which is inherently unreliable. Warp storms can cut off entire sectors for decades or even centuries. A world that is thriving and productive one year might be completely isolated the next, cut off from the supply lines that bring the food, the medicine, the reinforcements that keep its population alive. And when the storms clear, when contact is re-established, the first thing that arrives is not aid. It is not relief. It is the tithe collector, demanding 10,000 years of back payments plus interest, with the full weight of imperial law behind them. In hive worlds that find themselves temporarily cut off from warp travel face a uniquely terrifying scenario. These worlds are not self-sufficient. They cannot feed their own populations. They depend on imports of food from agri-worlds, and when those imports stop, famine follows with the certainty of nightfall following day. Within weeks, the food riots begin. Within months, the social order collapses. Within a few years, the hive cities become vast charnel houses, as their populations turned upon each other in a frenzy of desperation and madness. It has been said that a hive world rendered temporarily inaccessible through warp space will suffer devastating famine within a very short space of time, becoming a vast catacomb of lunatics driven to excesses of anarchic, urban savagery by starvation and claustrophobia. And when the Imperium finally returns to such a world, when the black ships and the tithe collectors and the administratum assessors arrive to find a planet in ruins, its population decimated by starvation and civil war, what happens then? Depending on the circumstances, one of two things. Either the world is judged to have failed in its duty and is punished accordingly, with the surviving population subjected to even harsher tithe requirements to make up for lost time, or the world is simply written off, as its population deemed too diminished to be worth the effort of rebuilding, and its name quietly removed from the rolls of productive imperial worlds. In either case, the suffering of the people who lived through the crisis is irrelevant to the decision. The only thing that matters is the numbers. And if you fall short, if you fail to produce what is demanded of you, if you dare to resist or complain or simply ask why, then the Imperium will teach you the meaning of compliance. Yeah, it will do so with fire and steel and the cold, mechanical indifference of a system that has been grinding human lives to dust for 10,000 years. But perhaps the most visceral, the most immediately disturbing aspect of life in the Imperium is not the abstract horror of the tithe or the crushing weight of the bureaucracy. It is something far more personal, far more intimate, far more deeply unsettling. It is the food. On many hive worlds, and the vast majority of the population subsists on a substance known as corpse starch. The name tells you everything you need to know, and yet the reality is somehow worse than even that grim label suggests. Corpse starch is a synthetic nutrient produced from the recycled remains of the dead, human dead. The bodies of imperial citizens who have lived and worked and died within the hive are collected by organizations known as corpse guilds, and which maintain a monopoly over the reclamation of the deceased. These guilds send out harvesting parties to scour mass graves, battlefields, plague zones, and mortuary vaults, gathering the dead with the same business-like efficiency that a farmer might bring in the harvest. The collected remains are then processed, broken down into their component proteins and nutrients, reconstituted into a grey paste or pressed into hard, tasteless bars, and distributed to the lower classes of the hive as their primary, and often only, source of food. The taste is described as flat, saline, faintly metallic, a flavor so universal that to complain about it is considered near heresy. On many worlds, open disgust toward the rations is punishable by consignment to penal servitude, because to reject the Imperium's bounty, no matter its form, is to reject the God Emperor himself. Let that settle in for a moment. Now the Imperium feeds its citizens to each other, not as an emergency measure, not as a last resort in desperate circumstances, but as a routine, everyday institutional practice that has been going on for thousands of years. The dead are recycled into food for the living, who will in turn die and be recycled into food for the next generation. It is a closed loop of consumption that reduces human life to its most basic biological function, fuel for the machine. You are born, you work, you die, and your body feeds the next worker, who will take your place at the assembly line. There is a terrible efficiency to it, a cold logic that strips away every pretense of dignity or meaning, and leaves nothing but the raw arithmetic of calories and protein content. And corpse starch is not even the worst of it. It is simply the most common. Across the Imperium, the food available to ordinary citizens ranges from merely unpleasant to actively harmful. Synthetic nutrients processed from algae, a fungus, and various forms of organic waste are standard fare on most worlds. Real food, the kind that was grown in actual soil or raised from actual animals, is a luxury reserved for the wealthy and the powerful. The average imperial citizen will live their entire life without ever tasting fresh fruit, real meat, or clean water that has not been recycled through processing plants so many times that the original molecules have been broken down and reassembled dozens of times over. But the water situation is, if anything, even more troubling than the food. In a hive city, every drop of water is recycled. The sweat from the factories, the waste from the hab blocks, the runoff from industrial processes, all of it is collected, filtered, treated, and redistributed. The filtration systems are ancient and often unreliable, which means that the water most citizens drink carries trace amounts of industrial chemicals, heavy metals, and biological contaminants. As chronic illness is not an exception in the lower hive, it is the norm. People drink the water because there is no alternative, and they sicken slowly, their bodies breaking down over years of cumulative exposure to substances that no human body was ever designed to process. And yet, the Imperium does not see this as a problem. It sees it as a solution. The hive city is a self-contained system, and within that system, nothing is wasted. Every output becomes an input. Every waste product is recycled into something useful. Every human being who dies feeds the machine that will produce the next human being to take their place. The system is efficient in its way, horribly, obscenely efficient. And it works after a fashion. The hive cities produce enormous quantities of manufactured goods, enormous quantities of soldiers, and enormous quantities of human misery. The Imperium considers 2 out of 3 to be acceptable returns on investment. Let us linger on the subject of corpse starch for a moment longer, because I think it reveals something essential about the Imperium's relationship with its citizens. The corpse guilds that manage the collection and processing of the dead are not shadowy, underground operations. They are legitimate, licensed organizations with official charters and recognized authority. On Necromunda, they are known as the Mercator Pallidus, and they operate openly, at their harvesting parties moving through the hive with the same unremarkable efficiency as a waste disposal crew in our world. They have contracts with the local authorities. They have quotas to meet. They have quality standards to maintain. The normalization of this practice is, in some ways, more disturbing than the practice itself. The citizens of the lower hive do not think of corpse starch as cannibalism. They do not recoil from it in horror. They eat it because it is food. The only food available to them. And they have been eating it for their entire lives, as did their parents and their grandparents, and every generation before them, stretching back into a past so distant that no one remembers a time when things were different. The knowledge that they are eating the processed remains of their dead neighbors, their dead co-workers, their dead friends and family members. It has been so thoroughly integrated into their daily existence that it provokes no more emotional response than the knowledge that the water they drink has been recycled through 1,000 other bodies before reaching their lips. This is what the Imperium does. It does not merely impose suffering on its citizens, it normalizes it. It makes the intolerable tolerable, the unthinkable routine, the monstrous mundane, when it takes horrors that should provoke revolution and transforms them into background noise, into the unremarkable texture of daily life. And it does this so effectively that the citizens themselves cannot see the horror anymore. They cannot feel it. They have been conditioned, through millennia of institutional pressure and cultural reinforcement, to accept their suffering as natural, inevitable, even righteous. To suffer in the Emperor's name is a virtue. To complain about your suffering is a sin. And to question why you are suffering at all is heresy.
Look, I just want to take a quick second here to say something as myself, not as a narrator. This is honestly one of the reasons I fell in love with the setting in the first place. The fact that Games Workshop built a universe where the so-called good guys are genuinely this awful, where you can't just point at the Imperium and say, yeah, those are the heroes. That takes guts. Most sci-fi gives you a clean faction to root for. 40k just hands you a gradient of nightmare and says, pick your favorite. And every time I sit down to research one of these topics, I end up going down some new rabbit hole that makes me go, oh, that's even worse than I thought. The servitor stuff in particular genuinely unsettles me more than any chaos or Tyranid lore ever has. Because at least those are alien threats. Servitors are what humans do to other humans on purpose and call it mercy. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Now, from the food that sustains the body Let us turn to the machinery that governs the mind. Because the Imperium does not control its citizens merely through deprivation and fear. It controls them through something far more insidious: paper. But while the hive cities grind their citizens into paste, both literally and figuratively, the administratum ensures that no world in the Imperium is spared the experience of institutional indifference. Because if the hive cities are the factories of the Imperium, the administratum is the machine that runs them. And like all machines in the Imperium, it is ancient, poorly maintained, and far more dangerous to its operators than it has any right to be. The Adeptus Administratum is the largest division of the Adeptus Terra, the governing body of the Imperium. It is, in essence, the civil service, the bureaucracy that keeps the wheels of imperial governance turning. And it is, without exaggeration, the most bloated, inefficient, and accidentally destructive organization in human history. Its servants number in the billions on Terra alone, and untold billions more across the galaxy. It is responsible for everything from population censuses to tithe collection, from military logistics to planetary classification, or from the deployment of colonists to the cataloguing of new worlds discovered on the fringes of imperial space. The problem is that the administratum has been doing this job for 10,000 years, and in that time, it has accumulated 10,000 years' worth of redundancy, contradiction, obsolescence, and simple human error. The bureaucracy has grown so large that it can no longer comprehend its own structure. Whole departments have been lost within the labyrinth of its own organization, as continuing to carry out functions that no longer serve any purpose, staffed by adepts who have no idea that their work is meaningless, but who dare not stop because to abandon their post is a capital offense. The effect of this on ordinary citizens is impossible to overstate. Every aspect of life in the Imperium is touched by the administratum's fumbling hand. The tithe levels set for your world might be based on a census that is 3 centuries out of date. The military reinforcements requested by your planetary governor might arrive decades after they were needed, or might be diverted to a completely different sector because of a clerical error. The food shipments that keep your hive city from starving might be delayed, rerouted, or simply lost in the system, and by the time anyone notices, your world might already be in the grip of famine. The Departamento Munitorum was the branch of the administratum responsible for the logistics of the Astra Militarum, is perhaps the most notorious example of bureaucratic incompetence in action. It is responsible for raising new regiments, providing equipment and supplies, and transporting troops to and from theaters of war. It is also responsible for some of the most absurd, tragic, and darkly comic failures of military logistics in the history of warfare. Stories abound of regiments requesting lasgun power packs and receiving dress uniforms for ogrins instead, of artillery units being supplied with ammunition designed for weapons they do not possess, of entire armies being deployed to the wrong planet because someone transposed 2 numbers in a coordinate reference. These are not rare occurrences. They are daily realities for the soldiers and citizens who depend on the Munitorum for their survival. And the consequences are not amusing. They are deadly. Soldiers die because their ammunition does not arrive. Worlds fall because their reinforcements are sent to the wrong system. Billions of people starve because the food shipments that were supposed to sustain them were rerouted to a front that no longer exists. And the administratum simply adjusts its records, notes the discrepancy, and moves on to the next item on its infinite agenda. Yes, there is a particularly chilling detail about the administratum that illustrates the depth of its institutional callousness. It maintains a division called the Historical Revision Unit, whose purpose is to revise historical records that may be considered subversive to imperial rule. This is not a euphemism. The administratum literally rewrites history to suit the needs of the present, erasing inconvenient facts, eliminating troublesome figures from the official record, and ensuring that the version of events taught to imperial citizens bears only the most tenuous relationship to what actually happened. The citizens of the Imperium do not merely live in ignorance. They live in a carefully curated ignorance, a controlled narrative designed to keep them compliant and obedient, by ensuring they never learn enough about their own history to question the system that governs them. If 1,000 adepts have to be purged simply to ensure the accuracy of a particular tithe repository's records, so be it. That is an actual principle of the administratum's operation. Nothing, not even the lives of its own servants, is personal. The machine serves the machine. The bureaucracy exists to perpetuate the bureaucracy, and the citizens who depend on it for everything from food distribution to military defense are simply passengers on a vehicle that neither knows nor cares where they want to go. There are stories, whispered in the corridors of power, and repeated with the grim humor of people who have no choice but to laugh at their own misery, that illustrate the absurdity of the administratum's dysfunction. There is the case of the Departamento Munitorum deciding, after 500 years of deliberation, that every lasgun in the Imperium needed a new attachment. The simple decision to add one small modification to one common weapon caused bureaucratic chaos on hundreds of worlds, sparking corruption, civil unrest, and institutional conflict across the entire Imperium. By the end of the first century of implementation, not even the tiniest fraction of lasguns had been modified, and the original specification had been altered beyond recognition. This the project becoming a self-perpetuating nightmare of interdepartmental rivalry and procedural gridlock. There is the fact that the administratum will gladly overlook genocidal interplanetary wars, mass starvation events, and the wholesale destruction of populations, as long as these catastrophes do not disrupt the flow of tithes to the Imperium. A world can tear itself apart in civil war, its cities burning and its people dying in millions. And the administratum will simply note the disruption in tithe delivery and schedule a review, which might be conducted sometime in the next decade or the next century, depending on the workload. The lives lost in the interim are not the administratum's concern. Its concern is the paperwork, and the paperwork must be correct, even if 1,000 adepts have to be purged to ensure it. There is also the phenomenon of forgotten worlds. Yes, planets that have simply fallen through the cracks of the administratum's record-keeping system and been lost, not destroyed, not conquered by aliens, not consumed by warp storms, just forgotten. Their records misfiled, their tithe schedules zeroed out through clerical error, their existence slowly fading from the collective memory of an organization too large to keep track of its own assets. These worlds continue to exist, their populations continuing to live and work and pray to the Emperor, and never knowing that in the eyes of the Imperium they effectively no longer exist. Some of them are eventually rediscovered, sometimes centuries later, and when the administratum's agents arrive, they find populations that have developed in complete isolation. Their cultures evolved in strange and unpredictable directions, their faith in the Emperor often wildly divergent from orthodox doctrine. The response to these rediscoveries is rarely gentle, and perhaps the most insidious aspect of the administratum's operation is the historical revision unit, whose existence most citizens are not even aware of. This division does not merely record history, it rewrites it. Inconvenient facts are erased. Troublesome figures are removed from the official record. The narrative of the Imperium's past is continuously edited and revised to suit the political needs of the present, in ensuring that the citizens' understanding of their own history is always exactly what the authorities want it to be. The Imperium does not merely control the present and the future, it controls the past. And in controlling the past, it controls the very ability of its citizens to imagine that things could ever have been, or could ever be, different. Now, we have talked about the places where Imperial citizens live, the food they eat, and the bureaucracy that governs their existence. But there is another horror lurking within the Imperium, one that strikes at the very concept of what it means to be human. And it walks among them every day, serving them in the most mundane of capacities, a constant, shambling reminder of what happens when the Imperium decides that your body is more useful than your mind. We need to talk about servitors. A servitor is, in the most clinical possible terms, a cybernetic construct created from a fusion of human flesh and robotic technology. They are the drones of the Imperium, performing the countless repetitive, dangerous and menial tasks that keep the machinery of civilization functioning. They maintain equipment. They carry heavy loads. They man gun emplacements. They clean corridors and operate machinery and perform 1,000 other functions that are too tedious, too hazardous, or too degrading for a fully conscious human being to perform. But a servitor is not a robot. It is not a machine with a human-shaped shell. A servitor is a human being. Or rather, it was a human being, before the Adeptus Mechanicus got hold of it. The process of creating a servitor, called servitorization, begins with a living person. Sometimes this person is a criminal who has been sentenced to servitude in perpetuis, the Imperium's polite term for being turned into a lobotomized cyborg. Sometimes it is a clone, vat-grown specifically for the purpose. And sometimes, though the Imperium would prefer you not think about this too carefully, it is simply someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone deemed expendable by a system that has a vast and ever-expanding definition of what expendable means. The process itself is a nightmare. The subject is lobotomized. Their higher brain functions destroyed or suppressed through a combination of surgery and cybernetic implants. Their personality, their memories, their capacity for independent thought, everything that made them a person is stripped away, leaving only the most basic neural functions necessary to operate their body and the machinery that has been grafted onto it. Their limbs may be replaced with tools or weapons. Their organs may be augmented with mechanical components. Their eyes may be removed and replaced with optical sensors. By the time the process is complete, there is nothing recognizable left of the person they once were. What remains is a shambling and semi-organic machine capable of performing its assigned task with mindless efficiency, but incapable of anything else. The most horrifying thing about servitors is not what has been done to them. It is the persistent, nagging, deeply uncomfortable question of what remains inside them. The official position of the Adeptus Mechanicus is that servitors are mindless, and that the lobotomization process destroys all consciousness and leaves nothing but a biological computer performing programmed functions. But the evidence suggests otherwise. In the game Darktide, medical servitors can be heard begging players not to leave them alone, asking to be taken along, expressing a desperate, piteous awareness that their minds are slipping away. Some novels in the lore describe psychers who can perceive the spiritual state of servitors, and what they see is agony, was a stunted, inarticulate suffering that the servitor cannot express or even fully comprehend, but that persists nonetheless. There is at least one documented case in the lore of a servitor being partially restored to consciousness, a man who was able to describe what the experience of servitorization was like from the inside. And what he described was a waking nightmare, fragments of memory and sensation breaking through the fog of lobotomization, like shards of glass through cotton wool. Enough to know that something terrible had happened, but not enough to understand what or why. The range of crimes that can lead to servitorization is breathtakingly broad. Obviously, serious offenses against the Adeptus Mechanicus or the Imperium at large can result in the sentence, but depending on the world and the local authorities, the threshold can be much, much lower. Petty theft, minor acts of disrespect toward imperial authority, yet even simple proximity to a crime scene when someone decides that someone ought to be punished. All of these can be enough to condemn a person to have their mind stripped away and their body turned into a machine. On some worlds, the number of crimes punishable by servitorization grows in direct proportion to the local demand for servitors. When a forge world needs more drone labor, the definition of criminal conveniently expands to fill the gap. Yes, and then there are the specialized variants that make ordinary servitors seem almost merciful by comparison. Choir drones are servitors configured to sing, sometimes a single note, gathered into groups of dozens or even thousands to provide perpetual hymns in imperial cathedrals. They stand there, day after day, their mouths open, their vocal cords producing sound without meaning, without feeling, without end. There are servitors that do nothing but swing incense censers, servitors that turn prayer wheels, servitors that beat drums, human beings stripped of everything that made them human, reduced to performing a single, repetitive, meaningless action for the glory of an emperor they can no longer comprehend. And then there are the murder servitors. The name is self-explanatory and deeply unsettling. These are servitors designed specifically for combat, heavily armed and armored, are unleashed upon enemies of the Imperium with the mindless ferocity that only a being without self-preservation instinct can achieve. They were people once. Someone's child, someone's friend, someone's parent. Now they are weapons, and when they are spent, they are discarded with less ceremony than a broken laser gun. Failed Space Marine initiates. Think about that for a moment. Young men who aspired to become humanity's greatest warriors, or who endured grueling trials and pushed their bodies to the breaking point in the hope of serving the Emperor as one of his chosen angels of death. Those who fail, those whose bodies reject the gene seed, or whose minds cannot withstand the process of transformation, sometimes face a fate worse than simple death. They are turned into servitors, their dreams of glory replaced with the mindless drudgery of hauling ammunition or scrubbing decks. That their awareness of what they might have been potentially still flickering somewhere in the ruined corridors of their lobotomized minds. The Imperium does not see this as cruel. The Imperium sees this as efficient. A failed aspirant is a waste of resources if simply discarded, but a servitor is a useful asset. The logic is impeccable. If you accept the premise that human beings are interchangeable components to be allocated wherever they produce the most value. And the Imperium has accepted that premise for 10,000 years. There is another dimension to the servitor horror that is worth exploring, and it concerns the sheer ubiquity of these creatures in Imperial life. Servitors are everywhere. They staff the corridors of every warship, maintain the machinery of every manufactorum, guard the gates of every fortress, and tend the altars of every cathedral. The average Imperial citizen encounters servitors on a daily basis, interacting with them with the same casual indifference that we might show toward a household appliance. They are part of the furniture of Imperial civilization, so commonplace and so unremarkable that most people never stop to think about what they actually are. And that ubiquity is itself a form of psychological control. Every servitor is a warning. Every lobotomized, shuffling, a half-human drone that passes you in the corridor is a reminder of what happens to those who transgress against the Imperium's laws. You do not need signs threatening punishment for disobedience when the punishment itself is walking beside you, carrying your luggage, serving your food, standing guard outside your door. The servitor does not need to speak to communicate its message. Its very existence says everything that needs to be said. Behave, or this is what you become. While the slave trade in the Imperium deserves mention here as well, because servitorization is not the only fate that awaits those who fall through the cracks of Imperial society. Slavery, in various forms, is endemic throughout the Imperium. Child laborers are used to clean the filth-caked vats of industrial algae farms, or to crawl through narrow water purification pipes too small for an adult to fit inside. On some worlds, the human trafficking organizations known as skin rings prey on the poor and vulnerable, luring them with promises of good jobs and then selling them into forced labor, prostitution, or worse. Joy houses, the Imperium's term for brothels, purchase these unfortunate souls from the traffickers and keep them locked up until they grow too old to be of use, at which point they are cast out onto the streets to fend for themselves, or simply processed and recycled like every other piece of human waste the hive produces. Imperial Navy vessels make regular stops at slave markets to replenish the ranks of their lower deck crew. The indentured ratings, who die in droves within the engineeriums and gunnery decks of the vast warships that patrol the Imperium's space lanes. These are not prisoners, they are not criminals. They are simply people who were available and expendable, purchased at market rates and put to work in conditions that would be considered genocidal if they were imposed by any external enemy. The Adeptus Mechanicus, for its part, views its human labor force with the same dispassionate regard that it shows toward any other component of its vast industrial apparatus. The tech priests believe that industry itself is a work of divinity, and they fuel their industrial output with the sweat of legions of slave labor, the augmented strength of unthinking servitor thralls, and the power of their monolithic forged temples. Workers in Mechanicus facilities are regarded as assets, numbers, and mortal resources to be maintained at whatever level of efficiency the machine god requires. Shock whips are common instruments used to provide additional encouragement to workers whose productivity falls below acceptable levels. And all of this, all of the slavery and the trafficking and the forced labor and the lobotomization, all of it happens under the watchful eye of an Imperium that officially claims to protect and serve its citizens. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking, but it is also, in a terrible way, perfectly logical. The Imperium does not recognize its citizens as people with inherent rights. It recognizes them as subjects with inherent duties. The distinction is everything. As if servitors represent the Imperium's willingness to consume the bodies of its citizens, then the treatment of psychers represents something even darker. Because what the Imperium does to its psychers is not merely physical destruction. It is the systematic harvesting and sacrifice of human souls. To understand this, you need to understand what a psyker is and why the Imperium both desperately needs them and pathologically fears them. A psyker is a human being born with the ability to tap into the warp, the hellish dimension of pure psychic energy that underlies the material universe. This ability manifests in many ways, from telepathy to telekinesis to precognition to far stranger and more terrible powers. Psychers are essential to the Imperium's survival. Without astropaths, the Imperium's interstellar communications network would collapse. Without navigators, faster-than-light warp travel would be impossible. Without the sacrifice of psyker life forces, the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides ships through the warp, would go dark, and the Imperium would shatter into 1 million isolated fragments within a generation. But psychers are also incredibly dangerous. Their connection to the warp makes them vulnerable to demonic possession, and a possessed psyker can become a gateway through which the horrors of the immaterium pour into the material world. An untrained, unsanctioned psyker is a ticking time bomb, a potential extinction-level threat to everyone around them. The Imperium has learned this lesson through bitter experience, paid for in the blood of billions. And so the Imperium has developed a system for dealing with the psyker problem. It is called the Black Ships. The Black Ships are the vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and they are among the most feared sights in the Imperium. They travel from world to world, collecting the tithe of psychers that every planet is required to provide. These psychers are typically identified by local authorities, often through the use of other psychers, or through the detection of unexplained phenomena in their vicinity, and they are gathered up, sometimes willingly, more often not, and delivered to the Black Ships for transport to Terra. The journey to Terra is a nightmare in itself. The Black Ships are not luxury liners. They are, for all practical purposes, slave transports, vast vessels packed with frightened, confused, and often hysterical psychers who have been torn from their homes and families and locked in cells designed to contain their powers. Many do not survive the journey. Some go mad. Some are killed by their fellow prisoners. Some are simply too weak to endure the stress of prolonged warp travel, while surrounded by the psychic emanations of hundreds of other terrified minds. Those who arrive at Terra alive face a sorting process that will determine the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives may be. The adepts of the Astra Telepathica evaluate each psycher's strength, willpower, and potential utility. The strongest, those with the most powerful gifts, and the mental discipline to control them, may be selected for training as sanctioned psychers. These individuals will undergo years of rigorous indoctrination, learning to harness their abilities in service to the Imperium. Some will become astropaths, the telepathic communicators who hold the Imperium together. Others will become battle psychers, weapons in the Astra Militarum's arsenal. A very rare few might be recruited into the Inquisition or other prestigious organizations, but these fortunate few are a tiny fraction of the total. But the vast majority of psykers collected by the black ships lack either the power or the willpower to serve as sanctioned psykers. And for these unfortunates, there is only one fate. They are offered up as sacrifices to the Emperor. Their life forces are drained away, consumed by the Golden Throne and the Astronomicon to maintain the psychic beacon that makes interstellar travel possible. 1,000 psykers a day. That is the current requirement. And it has only increased over the millennia as the Golden Throne decays and the Emperor's need for psychic sustenance grows. By some accounts, 4 times as many psykers are now sacrificed daily as were required in the early days after the Emperor's internment. 1,000 human beings, every single day, are brought into the chamber of the Astronomicon and have their lives, their minds, their very souls drained away to fuel a machine that keeps the Imperium functioning for one more day. These are not willing martyrs in most cases. They are people, ordinary people who happen to be born with a gift they never asked for, who were taken from their homes by force, transported across the galaxy in conditions of unimaginable suffering, and then fed into a machine that consumes them utterly. The Imperium calls them chosen. The imperial cult venerates them as martyrs. The official propaganda portrays their sacrifice as a glorious act of devotion to the God Emperor. But behind the rhetoric and the ceremony, behind the hymns and the prayers and the incense, the truth is simple and brutal. The Imperium kills 1,000 people a day to keep the lights on, and it has been doing so for 10,000 years. And then there is the soul-binding ritual itself, the process by which those psykers deemed strong enough to serve are prepared for their roles. This ritual involves being brought before the Emperor himself, or rather before the Shattered, a decaying remnant that sits upon the Golden Throne, and having a fraction of his psychic power forced into their minds. The process physically reshapes the psyker's neural architecture, rewriting portions of their brain to grant them the mental stability and control necessary to use their powers safely. The word agonizing does not begin to describe what this process feels like. Not all who undergo soul-binding survive. Of those who do, not all retain their sanity. And almost all of them suffer severe physical damage, most commonly the complete destruction of their optic nerves. Almost every astropath in the Imperium is blind, their eyes burned out by the sheer overwhelming power of the Emperor's psychic presence. Some lose their sense of smell. Some lose their sense of touch. Some emerge from the process with empty, shrunken eye sockets, their eyeballs literally incinerated by the experience. The psykers are brought before the Emperor 100 at a time, as in processions that have the trappings of religious ceremony, but the substance of industrial processing. They are prepared for months, fasting and praying, and then they kneel before the Golden Throne, and their minds are broken open and reshaped. Those who survive are sent out across the galaxy to serve, their damaged bodies sustained by sheer necessity and the faintest echo of the Emperor's power humming in what remains of their minds. Then they will spend the rest of their lives reaching into the hell of the warp, sending and receiving messages, knowing that every moment they do so puts them at risk of demonic attention, and knowing that if they falter, if their concentration slips for even an instant, a commissar with a bolt pistol is standing right behind them, ready to end the threat before it can spread. This is what the Imperium does to its psykers. It identifies them, it collects them, it sorts them, it binds them. It sacrifices them. And it does all of this not out of malice, but out of necessity, because without the sacrifice of these people, the Imperium would cease to exist. The horror is not that the Imperium is cruel. The horror is that it has no choice. Or at least, it believes it has no choice, which in practice amounts to the same thing. Let us dwell on the black ships for a moment longer, because they are perhaps the single most feared element of imperial governance. And their arrival in a system is an event that inspires a dread so deep and so primal that it borders on religious terror. When the black ships come, everyone knows what it means. Somewhere in the hive, in the hab blocks, in the scholar, in the cramped and filthy quarters where the poor and desperate live, there are people with the witch's curse, the psyker's gift, the the mutation that marks them as both essential and expendable, and those people are about to disappear. The collection process is brutal in its efficiency. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica works with local authorities to identify psychers, and the methods used range from the sophisticated, specialized equipment that can detect psychic emanations to the crude, informant networks that reward citizens for turning in their neighbors, their friends, even their own family members. There is a bounty for reporting a suspected psyker, and in the desperate economics of the lower hive, that bounty can mean the difference between eating and starving. Families are torn apart, children are ripped from their mother's arms, friends betray friends. The social bonds that hold communities together are weaponized by the system, turned into instruments of surveillance and control that ensure no psyker can hide for long. The journey aboard the black ships is a descent into a kind of hell that is difficult to describe and impossible to forget. The vessels are designed to contain psychic power, their hulls lined with materials that dampen and suppress the warp. But the passengers are not merely contained. They are imprisoned, locked in cells that are deliberately uncomfortable, deliberately isolating, deliberately designed to break down the psychological resistance of their occupants. The psychers are kept in darkness. They are fed barely enough to survive. They are subjected to constant psychic dampening that feels, to a psyker, like having a heavy wet blanket pressed over your mind, smothering the very sense that defines your existence. Some of the younger ones do not understand what is happening to them. They know only that they have been taken from everything they know, that they are in a dark place that hurts, that the people around them are frightened and weeping, and that no one will tell them why. The older ones understand perfectly well, and their understanding does not help them. It makes everything worse. They know where they are going. They know what waits for them at the end of the journey, and they know that there is nothing, absolutely nothing, they can do about it. The ones who arrive at Terra alive face a sorting process that is as methodical and as emotionless as a factory quality control inspection. The adepts of the Astra Telepathica evaluate each psyker's strength, willpower, and potential utility with instruments and techniques that are themselves terrifying in their precision. Each psyker is catalogued, classified, and assigned a destination. The strong go one way, the weak go another, and both paths lead, ultimately, to the same place: service unto death in the Emperor's name. For those deemed suitable for the Astronomicon, the journey does not end at the sorting. They are taken to the chamber of the Astronomicon, deep beneath the Himalaysian mountains, where the Emperor's psychic beacon burns like a lighthouse in the warp. There, they are initiated into the Adeptus Astronomica, trained in the philosophy and technical arcana of the beacon, and taught to use their powers in concert with the Emperor's will. Some achieve a mystic state, gaining the status of chosen, and it is these chosen who are eventually called to serve in the chamber itself, where they sit in concentric rings around the golden throne and pour their psychic energy into the beacon. The process is not instantaneous. The chosen do not simply arrive and die, or they fade. Their power is drained slowly, drawn out of them by the Emperor's need like blood being drawn through a needle. Day by day, their abilities diminish. Day by day, their physical bodies weaken. Day by day, the light in their eyes grows dimmer, and the voices in their minds grow quieter, until finally, gently, inevitably, they simply stop. They stop thinking. They stop feeling. They stop being. Their bodies remain seated in the chamber, in their hands still clasped in the ritual posture of devotion, their faces still turned toward the golden throne. But the person who once inhabited that body is gone, consumed utterly by the machine that devoured them. And before their bodies are cold, replacements are being prepared. The process never stops. The beacon must not go dark. The Imperium depends on it. Humanity depends on it. And so the sacrifice continues day after day, year after year, millennium after millennium. As 1,000 souls extinguished every 24 hours to keep the lights burning in a galaxy that is slowly drowning in darkness. From the silent screams of psychers drained of their life force, We turn now to the thundering misery of the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, the single largest military organization in human history and the single greatest consumer of human lives the galaxy has ever known. The numbers involved in the Astra Militarum are so vast as to be essentially meaningless. Yet trillions of soldiers serve at any given time, divided into millions of regiments deployed across the breadth of the galaxy. Every single year, trillions more are recruited, tithed, or conscripted to replace the fallen. The death toll of the Imperial Guard is measured not in individual casualties, but in regiments, in entire worlds' worth of fighting strength expended and consumed by the endless wars that rage across the Imperium's million worlds. And make no mistake, the citizens who serve in the Guard are not volunteers in any meaningful sense of the word. Some come willingly enough, driven by faith or patriotism, or simply the desire to escape the crushing poverty of whatever hellhole they were born into. But many, perhaps most, are conscripts, pulled from their homes and their families by the machinery of the imperial tithe, and given no more choice in the matter than a cog has in choosing which machine it serves. But the process of conscription varies from world to world, but the outcome is always the same. Young men and women, often barely more than children, are taken from everything they know, given a lasgun and a copy of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer, a hilariously inaccurate manual that deliberately downplays the threats they will face, and shipped off-world on a one-way journey. It is not considered likely that any guardsman will ever return to their world of origin. A fading memory of home is considered one of the average guardsman's most constant companions. They will fight and die on worlds they have never heard of, against enemies they cannot comprehend, in wars that will be forgotten before their bodies have cooled. The conditions of service in the Imperial Guard are, by any standard, abysmal. The average guardsman is equipped with a lasgun, as a weapon that is effective enough against unarmored targets but woefully inadequate against the kind of threats the Guard routinely faces. Power-armored Chaos Marines, heavily armored Orc warriors, the chitin-plated nightmares of a Tyranid swarm. Against these foes, a lasgun is only slightly more effective than a harsh word and a throwing rock. The Guard compensates for this technological disadvantage with the only resource it has in abundance: bodies. But the standard tactical doctrine of the Astra Militarum is to overwhelm the enemy through sheer weight of numbers, to bury them under an avalanche of flesh and lass fire until they simply cannot kill fast enough to stem the tide. This is not a subtle strategy, it is not an elegant strategy, but it is the only strategy available to an army whose individual soldiers are, in the cold calculus of imperial military planning, essentially worthless. A single Space Marine is a priceless asset, as a masterwork of genetic engineering and training that represents decades of investment. A single guardsman is a replaceable component, the product of a few months of basic training and a few thrones worth of standard issue equipment. When a Space Marine falls, it is a tragedy. When a guardsman falls, it is a statistic. And there are always more statistics where that one came from. The Commissariat, the political officers of the Guard, exists not to inspire the troops or improve morale, but to ensure compliance through fear. Commissars have the authority to execute any soldier under their command for any infraction, from cowardice to insubordination to simply questioning an order. While some commissars lead by example and earn the genuine respect of their troops, the institution itself is designed to maintain discipline through the liberal application of summary execution. The message is clear. You can die fighting the enemy, or you can die at the hands of your own commander. Or either way, you are going to die. The only choice you have is which direction you face when it happens. And then there are the penal legions, the Imperium's answer to the question of what to do with soldiers who have committed crimes but are not considered worth the effort of executing individually. These are units composed entirely of criminals, murderers, psychopaths, deserters, and anyone else who has fallen afoul of imperial military law. They are given the most dangerous assignments, sent into the most hopeless situations, and expected to atone for their crimes by dying in the most useful manner possible. Their explosive collars or control implants ensure they cannot flee. Their officers are invariably commissars with itchy trigger fingers, and their life expectancy is measured in hours, not days. The truly chilling thing about the penal legions is the breadth of crimes that can land a soldier in one. Yet capital crimes in the Imperium encompass such an extraordinary range of offences that it is virtually impossible for a citizen to go through their entire life without technically committing at least one. And once you are in a penal legion, there is no way out except death, which the Imperium is more than happy to provide. The life of an ordinary guardsman, even one not condemned to a penal legion, is one of grinding misery punctuated by moments of sheer blind terror. But consider the emotional reality of being shipped away from everything you have ever known, placed on a transport vessel that may take months or even years to reach its destination, and deposited on a world whose name you cannot pronounce, whose climate you are not adapted to, and whose threats you have been given only the most cursory and deliberately misleading information about. The Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer, the standard issue handbook given to all guardsmen, systematically understates the capabilities of every enemy the guard faces. Orcs are described as cowardly and easily scattered. Chaos forces are dismissed as deluded cultists. Tyranids are barely mentioned at all. The primer does this deliberately because the Imperium has calculated that a soldier who understands the true nature of the threats they face is more likely to break and run than one who has been fed comfortable lies. When the reality of combat finally arrives, when the guardsman stands in a trench and sees the enemy for the first time, the disconnect between the primer's reassurances and the actual situation is psychologically devastating. The orcs are not cowardly. They are 10-foot-tall biological engines of destruction whose battle frenzy is a force of nature that no amount of lass fire can easily stem. The Chaos Marines are not deluded cultists. They are power-armored super soldiers infused with the power of malevolent gods, each one capable of cutting through a squad of guardsmen like a blade through wet paper. And the Tyranids are not barely worth mentioning. They are a seething ocean of chitin and claws and acidic saliva, a swarm intelligence that adapts and evolves in real time, that learns from every engagement and becomes harder to kill with every battle. Against these threats, the guardsman has a lasgun and a prayer. Both are equally effective, which is to say, barely effective at all. And yet, the guard fights. The guard holds. The guard dies in numbers that make the great wars of old Earth look like schoolyard scuffles, and it does so because it has no choice. The commissar at its back ensures compliance. The faith of the emperor sustains what the commissar cannot, and the sheer, stubborn, irrational courage of ordinary human beings, the same courage that has driven our species through every crisis from the caves to the stars, carries them forward into the teeth of enemies that should by rights reduce them to gibbering wrecks of trauma and despair. The logistical nightmare of supporting the guard adds another layer of suffering to the guardsman's already miserable existence. Because the Departamento Munitorum, as we have discussed, is not exactly known for its efficiency, a regiment deployed to a jungle world might receive winter gear. A regiment fighting armored opponents might be supplied with anti-personnel rounds. A regiment on the verge of starvation might receive, instead of food, 1,000 crates of left boots. These are not hypothetical scenarios. They are the kind of absurdity that the Munitorum produces on a regular basis, and while they make for darkly amusing stories, the reality for the soldiers on the ground is anything but funny. People die because the system that is supposed to keep them alive cannot be bothered to function properly. The emotional toll of service in the guard is perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. A fading memory of home is considered one of the average guardsman's most constant companions, and that phrasing, with its gentle euphemism and its quiet acceptance of permanent exile, says everything about the Imperium's attitude toward the emotional welfare of its soldiers. You will never go home. You will never see your family again. You will never stand in the place where you were born and feel the ground beneath your feet and know that you belong there, that life is over. It ended the moment the tithe collector pointed at you and a sergeant handed you a lasgun. Everything that comes after is just waiting to die. Some regiments, through valor and sacrifice, earn the right of settlement on worlds they have fought to defend. Their officers become the new nobility, their soldiers the new population, building new lives on the ruins of whatever conflict earned them their reward. This is held up as the great prize, the shining hope that keeps guardsmen fighting through impossible odds. But for the vast majority, there is no settlement, no reward, no happy ending. There is just the next battle, the next deployment, the next chance to die on a world that does not know their name and will not remember their sacrifice. The mass conscription on a scale that defies imagination is not merely a possibility in the Imperium. It is a routine occurrence. Entire hive cities have been emptied to fuel war efforts, their populations swept up in conscription drives so thorough that the only people left behind are those too old, too young, or too broken to hold a weapon. These hastily assembled conscripts receive only the barest training and the most minimal equipment before being shipped to the front, where they are used, with brutal honesty, as expendable human shields to protect more valuable assets. It has been said that the sacrifice of over 1 million Imperial soldiers is worth one day's hive world production in weapons and armor. Think about that equation. Think about what it says about the value the Imperium places on human life. 1 million soldiers, each one a person with a name and a face and a life that meant something to someone, somewhere, balanced against one day's industrial output. And the production wins, every time, without question, without hesitation. But the Imperium does not control its citizens through force alone. Force is crude, expensive, and requires constant maintenance. For a truly effective system of oppression, you need something more elegant, more pervasive, more deeply embedded in the psyche of every man, woman, and child under your dominion. You need faith. The imperial cult, administered by the Adeptus Ministorum, commonly known as the Ecclesiarchy, it is the state religion of the Imperium of man. It is also, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful instruments of social control ever devised. Its basic tenets are simple. The emperor is a god, the one and only true god. To worship any other power is heresy. To question the authority of the emperor's servants is heresy. To deviate from the approved forms of worship is heresy, and heresy is punishable by death, or worse. The irony, the bitter cosmic irony of the imperial cult, is that the emperor himself explicitly rejected the idea of being worshipped as a god. During the Great Crusade, 10,000 years before the present day of the setting, the emperor outlawed organized religion in all its forms. He declared it the source of much of the strife and ignorance that had prevented humanity from achieving its potential. The official doctrine of the early Imperium, called the Imperial Truth, held that the emperor was the greatest of human beings, the rightful ruler of mankind, but a human being nonetheless. There were no gods, the emperor insisted. There was only the truth of science and reason. But the emperor's truth died with the emperor's dream. After the Horus heresy, after the emperor was interred upon the golden throne, the very worship he had forbidden took root and spread like wildfire. Within a few centuries, the temple of the Savior Emperor had become the dominant religious movement in the Imperium. By the 32nd millennium, and it was the official state religion. And in the 10,000 years since, it has grown into an organization of staggering power and influence, controlling not just the spiritual lives of the Imperium's citizens, but their political, social, and economic lives as well. The Ecclesiarchy teaches its followers that every human being has a place within the Emperor's divine order, that to obey the authority of the imperial government and one's superiors is a sacred duty, that suffering and sacrifice in the Emperor's name are the highest virtues, that to question, to doubt, to deviate even slightly from the approved doctrine is to invite damnation. The religion does not merely discourage independent thought, it actively punishes it. The boundary between acceptable faith and heresy is thin, and it shifts constantly, much depending on the political needs of the moment and the theological opinions of whichever cardinal happens to hold authority over a given region of space. Confession to a sin is effectively confessing to a religious crime, and the Church has near total power to punish religious offences. Let that sink in. The ecclesiarchy is not merely a spiritual authority, it is a judicial one. Its priests can condemn citizens to punishment for thought crimes, for private doubts whispered in the confessional, and for failures of devotion that exist only in the interior landscape of a person's mind. And the punishments it metes out are not gentle, which brings us to one of the most disturbing practices in the entire Imperium: archoflagellation. An archoflagellant is a human being who has been condemned for heresy and then transformed, through a combination of cybernetic surgery and chemical enhancement, into a living weapon. The process begins with the condemned being handed over to the Adeptus Mechanicus, who lobotomize them and replace their arms with cybernetic weapons, typically electroflails or industrial cutting shears. Batteries of chemical injectors are grafted directly onto their spine. A pacifier helmet is installed, containing a crude mind impulse unit that connects directly to their cerebrum and spinal cord, keeping them in a state of barely conscious docility through a constant feed of imperial chants, sermons, and religious imagery projected directly into their brain. When the trigger word is spoken, the pacifier helmet deactivates. The chemical injectors flood the archoflagellant system with a cocktail of combat stimulants and painkillers. And the thing that was once a person becomes a berserk whirlwind of destruction, utterly impervious to pain, utterly devoid of self-preservation, attacking everything in its vicinity that is not identified as friendly with the mindless fury of a cornered animal. When the killing is done, another trigger word reactivates the helmet, and the archoflagellant returns to its semi-conscious stupor, standing slack-jawed and swaying, while the litanies of the Emperor play on an endless loop inside its shattered mind. The official justification for archoflagellation is that it is a form of penitence. If the condemned is given the opportunity to atone for their sins through suffering and service, and their death in battle is considered a form of redemption. The physical agony of the transformation, the chemical fires that burn through their nervous system, the loss of everything that made them human, all of this is presented as a spiritual cleansing, a purification of the soul through the mortification of the flesh. But the truth is simpler and uglier. Archoflagellants are cheap, more disposable shock troops. They are human beings turned into guided missiles, aimed at the Imperium's enemies and detonated on impact. The ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition use them as terror weapons, deploying them in packs against heretics and aliens alike, secure in the knowledge that the archoflagellants will fight until they are destroyed and will require neither pay, nor food, nor quarters, nor any of the other logistical burdens that come with maintaining actual soldiers. And the crimes that can result in this sentence, they need not be dramatic acts of blasphemy or deliberate heresy. They can be as simple as expressing the wrong opinion about a point of religious doctrine, or failing to show sufficient enthusiasm during a devotional service, or simply being in the wrong place when a zealous priest decides that an example needs to be made. The ecclesiarchy does not need evidence. It does not need proof. Confession, and extracted through whatever means are deemed necessary, is sufficient. And once the sentence is passed, there is no appeal, no mercy, and no escape. The ecclesiarchy has, over the millennia, accumulated such vast wealth and political power that it has, at times, threatened to overwhelm even the administratum in influence. During the 36th millennium, a period known as the Age of Apostasy, the ecclesiarchy's corruption and excess reached such extremes that the entire Imperium was nearly torn apart. But the High Lord Goj van Dyer seized control of both the administratum and the ecclesiarchy, becoming the most powerful individual in the Imperium, and his reign of blood saw massive purges, assassinations, and the wholesale slaughter of anyone who dared oppose him. It was only through the intervention of Sebastian Thor and his Confederation of Light that the ecclesiarchy was reformed and its worst excesses curtailed. But the reign of blood is worth dwelling on because it illustrates a fundamental truth about the Imperium. The institutions that are supposed to protect its citizens are, more often than not, the greatest threats to their safety. Goga Vandir did not seize power through alien invasion or daimonic corruption. He seized it through the perfectly legal mechanisms of imperial governance, exploiting the overlap between the administratum and the ecclesiarchy to concentrate authority in his own hands. Yet his purges killed millions, his wars of faith devastated entire sectors, and he did all of it while claiming to act in the emperor's name, using the very language of faith and duty that the Imperium had spent millennia embedding in the minds of its citizens. The reforms that followed the Age of Apostasy helped, to a degree. The decree passive forbade the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms, though it found a loophole by establishing the all-female Adepta Sororitas, as the Sisters of Battle, whose existence did not technically violate the decree's gendered language. But the fundamental nature of the institution did not change. The ecclesiarchy still controls the spiritual lives of the Imperium citizens. It still enforces orthodoxy through fear and violence. It still teaches that blind obedience is the highest virtue and independent thought is the greatest sin. And it still finds new and creative ways to punish those who fail to meet its standards of devotion. Standards that shift and change with the political winds, ensuring that no citizen can ever be truly certain that they are safe from the accusation of heresy. The Schola Progenium deserves special mention as another tool of the ecclesiarchy's control. These are the orphanages run by the Ministorum, where the children of imperial servants who have died in service are raised and trained. Orphans of the Schola receive a strict orthodox imperial cult education and are conditioned from the earliest possible age to regard the emperor as their spiritual father. They are taught absolute obedience, absolute devotion, and absolute faith. Many of the Imperium's most fanatical servants, from commissars to stormtroopers to sisters of battle, are products of the Schola. They are, in effect, children who have been institutionally raised to become weapons. Their capacity for independent thought carefully pruned away and replaced with the reflexive obedience that the Imperium prizes above all other qualities. These children did not choose this life. Their parents did not choose it for them. Their parents are dead, killed in the Emperor's service, and their reward for that sacrifice is to have their children taken and molded into instruments of the same system that consumed their parents. The cycle is complete and self-sustaining. While the Imperium kills its servants, takes their children, turns those children into new servants, and eventually kills them too, at which point the cycle begins again. Generation after generation, stretching back through millennia, an endless conveyor belt of human lives fed into the machinery of imperial governance and ground to dust. We should also speak briefly about the fate of those who are born different, those who through no fault of their own deviate from the narrow definition of genetic normalcy that the Imperium enforces with lethal rigor. Mutants, those whose genetics have been altered by exposure to radiation, toxins, or the subtle influence of the warp, are among the most despised and persecuted groups in imperial society. The imperial creed teaches that genetic purity is a sacred duty, and that mutation is a sign of spiritual corruption, a punishment from the emperor for some unspecified sin. Never mind that mutation in the lower hive is almost always the result of centuries of exposure to the industrial pollutants that the Imperium itself has allowed to accumulate. Never mind that many mutations are cosmetic or trivial: extra fingers, unusual pigmentation, slight physical deformities that have no bearing on a person's ability to work or serve. The doctrine is clear: the mutant is not fully human, and therefore does not deserve the full protection of imperial law. In practice, this means that mutants are subject to varying degrees of persecution, depending on the world and the local authorities. On more tolerant worlds, mutants may be confined to ghettos or assigned to the most dangerous and unpleasant jobs. On less tolerant worlds, they are hunted, killed on sight, or rounded up for servitorization. In the underhive, and where the concentration of environmental toxins is highest and the rate of mutation correspondingly elevated, entire communities of mutants have developed in the deepest, darkest corners of the hive. surviving on whatever scraps and refuse trickle down from above, always one unlucky encounter with a patrol of zealots or enforcers away from extermination. Even the recognized abhumans, those stable mutant strains that the Imperium has grudgingly accepted as useful, unlike the Ogrins and the Ratlings, exist in a state of permanent second-class citizenship. They are tolerated because they are useful, the Ogrins as shock troops and the Ratlings as snipers and scouts, but they are never accepted. They are always alien, always other, always one theological reinterpretation away from being reclassified as unclean and subject to the same persecution that befalls their less fortunate cousins. And then there is the Inquisition, the Imperium's secret police, in its judge, jury, and executioner rolled into one. We could spend an entire evening discussing the Inquisition alone, its structure, its divisions, its methods, its internal conflicts. But for our purposes tonight, the most relevant fact about the Inquisition is this: an inquisitor answers to no one. No authority in the Imperium, save another inquisitor of equal or higher standing, can countermand an inquisitor's orders. They can requisition any resource. They can commandeer any military force. They can condemn any individual, from the lowest underhive scavenger to the most powerful planetary governor, without trial, without evidence, without appeal. In the hands of a wise and principled inquisitor, this authority can be a force for genuine good, rooting out corruption and alien influence that might otherwise go unchecked. But wisdom and principle are not prerequisites for the position, and the Imperium's 10,000-year history is littered with the wreckage left by inquisitors who were zealous or paranoid or simply mad. Entire worlds have been subjected to purges on the basis of an inquisitor's suspicion, their populations decimated by witch hunts that found heresy where none existed, that destroyed innocent lives in the pursuit of threats that were imaginary, exaggerated, or manufactured to justify the inquisitor's own existence. The citizens of the Imperium live under the constant, ambient awareness that at any moment, without warning or reason, someone with absolute authority might decide that their world, their community, their family, or they themselves represent a threat to the Imperium. And when that happens, there is nothing to be done. No appeal, no defense, no escape. You simply cease to exist, erased from the record as thoroughly as if you had never been born. This is the air that Imperial citizens breathe, as the water they drink, the food they eat, not just the physical toxins and the recycled dead, but the psychological toxins of a system that has made terror the foundation of social order. Fear of the alien, fear of the mutant, fear of the psyker, fear of the heretic, fear of the inquisitor, fear of the commissar, fear of the gang boss, the shift foreman, the tithe collector, the press gang, the corpse guild, the black ship, the adeptus arbites, layer upon layer of fear, all each one reinforcing the others, each one ensuring that the citizen remains in their place, obedient and productive, and too terrified to do anything other than exactly what they are told. And yet, for all the horrors we have discussed so far, from the grinding misery of the hive cities to the institutional nightmare of the administratum, from the living death of servitors to the soul harvesting of psychers, from the meat grinder of the Imperial Guard to the spiritual tyranny of the ecclesiarchy, there is one final horror that stands above all others in its sheer, incomprehensible scale. Exterminatus. Exterminatus is the Imperium's ultimate sanction, its final answer to any threat that it deems too dangerous or too costly to address by conventional means. It is, in the simplest possible terms, the deliberate destruction of an entire planetary biosphere, the killing of every living thing on a world's surface, from the mightiest predator to the smallest bacterium. When the Imperium declares exterminatus on a world, it does not discriminate between guilty and innocent, between combatant and civilian, between the corruption that prompted the action and the billions of loyal Imperial citizens who happen to be living on the wrong planet at the wrong time. The methods vary. Orbital bombardment is the simplest. Warships in orbit hammering the planet's surface with enough firepower to reduce cities to rubble and oceans to steam. Our virus bombs release the life-eater virus, a genetically engineered pathogen so voracious that it can spread across an entire planet in minutes, dissolving every living thing it touches into an organic sludge that then releases vast quantities of flammable gas. A single spark, a single lance strike from orbit, ignites this gas into a planet-wide firestorm that scours the surface to bare rock and burns the atmosphere of all oxygen. Cyclonic torpedoes possess the capability to destroy an entire biosphere through thermonuclear fire, cracking a planet's crust and destabilizing its core. The authorization for Exterminatus can come from any Inquisitor, any Space Marine Chapter Master, any Lord High Admiral, or any Lord Commander. The oversight on these orders is, practically speaking, non-existent. While the official policy is that Exterminatus should only be used in the most extreme circumstances, when a world has fallen so far to corruption or alien infestation that no other option remains, the reality is far more subjective. Some Inquisitors are known to be trigger-happy, ordering the destruction of worlds over threats that might have been contained by less dramatic means. And while roughly 90% of Inquisitors who order Exterminatus are later stripped of their rank for excessive force, yes, that statistic offers little comfort to the billions who died before the review board convened. Think about what this means for the ordinary citizens of the Imperium. You live your life in service to the Emperor. You work your 16-hour shifts. You eat your corpse starch without complaining. You say your prayers and attend your devotional services and keep your head down and do everything that is asked of you. And then one day, through no fault of your own, your world is judged to be beyond saving and fire falls from the sky. Not because of anything you did, not because of anything you could have prevented. Simply because the mathematics of imperial strategic planning determined that the resources required to save your world exceeded the value your world produced, and the erasure of your entire civilization was deemed an acceptable loss. The Imperium will not mourn you. The Imperium will not remember you. Your world's name will be struck from the records, its coordinates flagged as a dead zone, its contribution to the imperial tithe zeroed out and redistributed among your neighbors. Within a generation, you will be forgotten entirely, your existence reduced to a footnote in an archive that no one will ever read. There is a quote attributed to the Departamento Munitorum that captures the Imperium's attitude toward Exterminatus with chilling precision. It reads simply, "Billions dead, unacceptable losses." That is the Imperium of man in 6 words. Billions dead, acceptable losses. Not a tragedy, not a failure, not even a particularly notable event. Just a line in a ledger, to be balanced against other lines in other ledgers, in the endless, grinding, soul-crushing arithmetic of survival at any cost. The historical record of Exterminatus' actions is both extensive and deeply disturbing. During the Horus heresy, the traitor Warmaster Horus himself used virus bombs on Istvan III to cull those space marines within his own legions who he judged likely to remain loyal to the Emperor. The virus swept across the planet's surface in minutes, dissolving every living thing it touched into organic sludge, releasing vast clouds of flammable gas that were then ignited by orbital lance strikes into a planet-wide firestorm. That was the first recorded use of Exterminatus-level weapons. And it was carried out not against an alien threat or a demonic incursion, but against the Imperium's own soldiers, by the Imperium's own Warmaster, in the opening act of a civil war that would nearly destroy everything the Emperor had built. Since then, Exterminatus has been used countless times, against worlds infested by genestealer cults, whose alien parasites burrow into human populations and corrupt them from within. Against worlds fallen to chaos worship, where the very fabric of reality has been torn open by the accumulated malice of a damned populace. Against worlds overrun by orcs, where the green tide has grown so thick and so entrenched that no conventional military force could hope to dislodge it. And, in at least some cases, against worlds where the threat was ambiguous, where the evidence was incomplete, where a zealous inquisitor made a judgment call and billions paid the price. Say, there is a particular case that illustrates the arbitrary horror of exterminatus with painful clarity. An inquisitor named Dinalt discovered that a member of his retinue had become stranded on a primitive world and was being worshipped as a goddess by the native population. Dinalt judged this to be heresy and ordered the destruction of the entire planet using virus bombs. An entire world, with its entire population, annihilated because a single person was being worshipped incorrectly. That is the power of an inquisitor. That is the standard of judgment that stands between an imperial world and annihilation. And there is essentially no oversight, no appeal, no mechanism by which the condemned can argue their case before the torpedoes fly. The aftermath of an exterminatus is a dead world, a barren sphere of blasted rock stripped of its atmosphere, its oceans, its soil, and every trace of the life that once inhabited it. In some cases, but these dead worlds are reclaimed by the Adeptus Mechanicus, stripped of whatever mineral resources remain and converted into mining operations. The irony is thick enough to taste. A world that was home to billions of imperial citizens, that contributed to the imperial tithe, that served the emperor faithfully for generations, is destroyed by the Imperium itself, and then strip-mined by the very organization whose inability to reclaim it was the justification for its destruction in the first place. And exterminatus is not even the most extreme form of planetary-scale violence the Imperium is capable of. It is merely the most well-known. There are other methods, other tools, in the arsenal of a civilization that has been waging war for 10 millennia and has refined the art of mass destruction to a degree that would make the most ambitious tyrants of old Earth weep with envy. The Imperium has at its disposal weapons that can crack a planet's crust and destabilize its core. It has pathogens that can be keyed to specific genetic markers, targeting specific populations while leaving others untouched. It has cyclonic torpedoes that can burn an atmosphere to nothing and boil oceans to vapor in a matter of hours. And it uses all of these things with a regularity that suggests they are not exceptional measures, but standard operating procedures, as tools to be deployed whenever the mathematics of imperial strategic planning determine that destruction is cheaper than salvation. The Imperium's relationship with its own worlds is, at its most fundamental level, a relationship between a farmer and his fields. A good field is cultivated, maintained, and harvested. A bad field is burned, and the ashes ploughed under to make way for new growth. The citizens who live on these worlds are not consulted about their classification any more than wheat is consulted about the harvest. They exist to produce, and when they can no longer produce, or when the cost of maintaining them exceeds their output, they are expendable. This agricultural metaphor extends even to the language the Imperium uses to describe its own operations. The imperial tithe is sometimes called the Grand Harvest. The collection of cycles is described in terms of reaping and gathering. Worlds are cultivated, exploited, and when necessary, culled. The language of agriculture, of animal husbandry, of resource management, permeates every level of imperial governance, and it reveals a truth that the Imperium's propaganda works tirelessly to conceal. The citizens of the Imperium are not people. They are livestock. They are managed, maintained, and slaughtered according to the same principles that govern any efficient farming operation. The only difference is the scale. And here we arrive at what is perhaps the central paradox of the Imperium of man, the contradiction that lies at the heart of everything we have discussed tonight. The Imperium claims to exist for the protection of humanity. It claims that every sacrifice it demands, every horror it perpetuates, as every life it consumes is justified by the ultimate goal of ensuring that humanity survives in a galaxy that wants it dead. And yet, in the pursuit of that goal, the Imperium has created a system that strips away everything that makes humanity worth protecting. It has taken the species it claims to serve and reduced it to raw material, to fuel, to ammunition for an endless war that has no victory condition and no end state. What is the point of saving humanity if you destroy everything that makes it human in the process? What is the point of defeating the alien and the demon if the civilization you preserve is itself a kind of damnation? These are questions that the Imperium cannot afford to ask, and that its citizens are forbidden from asking, and that we, sitting outside the setting and looking in, must ask on their behalf. The answer, if there is one, is that there is no answer. The Imperium is trapped in a cycle of its own making, a self-perpetuating nightmare from which there is no escape and no awakening. It cannot become more humane because the threats it faces are too severe. It cannot reduce the suffering of its citizens because the resources are already stretched too thin. It cannot reform its institutions because those institutions have become so vast and so deeply entrenched that they are effectively forces of nature, as immovable and as indifferent as the stars themselves. The Imperium is not a government. It is a geological phenomenon, a tectonic force that grinds across the galaxy with the slow, inexorable momentum of a continent, crushing everything in its path, including its own people. And so we come to the end of our journey through the Imperium of man, though in truth, we have barely scratched the surface. We have not spoken of the Inquisition, those secretive and all-powerful individuals who operate above the law, who can condemn worlds and absolve heretics with equal authority, who maintain their own private armies and answer to no one but their own conscience, assuming they still have one. We have not spoken of the Adeptus Arbites, the Judge Dredd-like enforcers who patrol the Imperium, dispensing a justice that is swift, brutal, and often wildly disproportionate to the offense. We have not spoken of the Navigator houses, whose mutant bloodlines are simultaneously indispensable and reviled, or the rogue traders, whose charters grant them license to operate beyond the borders of imperial law. There is so much more to say, so many more horrors to catalogue, so many more ways in which the Imperium consumes its own people in the name of survival. But I think the picture is clear enough. The Imperium of man is not the shining beacon of human civilization that its propaganda claims. It is a machine, a vast and ancient and mindless, fueled by human suffering and sustained by human blood. It does not exist to serve its citizens. Its citizens exist to serve it. They are resources to be extracted, components to be allocated, fuel to be burned. Their comfort does not matter. Their happiness does not matter. Their individual lives, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, none of it matters. All that matters is that the machine keeps running, that the tithes keep flowing, and that the armies keep marching, that the Astronomicon keeps burning. And the most terrible irony of all is that, in some fundamental sense, the Imperium may be right. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is a place of such overwhelming, incomprehensible danger that perhaps only a regime this brutal, this oppressive, this utterly indifferent to the welfare of its own people could hope to survive in it. The Chaos Gods hunger for human souls. The tyrannid hive fleets consume entire worlds. But the Necrons awaken from their tomb worlds with the cold, patient malice of machines that have been waiting for 60 million years. The Orcs rampage across the galaxy in a tide of green-skinned destruction, their bellowing war cries shaking the very stars. Against threats like these, perhaps the only option is to become something monstrous yourself. Perhaps the price of survival really is the sacrifice of everything that makes survival worth having. But that does not make it any less horrifying. And it does not make the suffering of the Imperium's citizens any less real. They are not statistics. They are not resources. They are not inputs in an equation. They are people. Billions upon billions of people, living and dying in conditions that we, sitting here in the comfort of our own lives, can barely begin to imagine. And they deserve to be seen. They deserve to be acknowledged. They deserve, at the very least, to have someone bear witness to what is done to them in the name of the God Emperor of mankind. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there may be only war, but behind the war, beneath the war, woven into every battlefield and every victory, and every defeat, there is something else. There is the quiet, relentless, everyday suffering of ordinary people who were never given a choice. And that, more than any demon or alien or traitor, is the true horror of the Imperium of Man. What makes this setting so compelling, what keeps us coming back to it year after year, is not the spectacle of superhuman warriors or the grandeur of galaxy-spanning conflict. It is this. It is the human element. It is the knowledge that somewhere beneath all the power armor and the macro cannons and the planet-killing weapons, there are people, real people, or as real as fictional people can be, living lives of quiet desperation in a system that regards them as fuel. And in their stories, yet in their suffering, in their stubborn, irrational refusal to simply lie down and die, we see something of ourselves. We see the universal human experience of being small and vulnerable in a world that does not care about us, of searching for meaning in a universe that offers none, of holding on to hope even when hope has been declared a capital offense. The Imperium of Man is a mirror, darkened and distorted but recognizable nonetheless in its bureaucratic indifference, as we see the worst tendencies of our own institutions. In its religious fanaticism, we see the shadows of our own history. In its willingness to sacrifice the individual for the collective, we see the arguments that have been used to justify atrocities throughout human civilization. And in the ordinary citizens who endure all of this, who get up every morning and go to work and eat their grey rations and say their prayers and somehow, against all odds and all reason, keep going. Or we see the most fundamental truth of the human condition. We endure, not because we are strong, not because we are brave, but simply because we have no other option. The siren screams, and we get up and we go on. The 41st millennium is not a prediction. It is not a warning, not exactly. It is a thought experiment carried to its logical extreme. What happens when a civilization decides that the survival of the species is more important than the dignity of the individual? What happens when that decision is sustained for 10,000 years, hardened into dogma, sanctified by religion, and enforced at gunpoint? What happens is the Imperium of Man, and what happens to the people who live in it is the story we have told tonight. There is one last thing I want to leave you with, and it is perhaps the most troubling thought of all. The Imperium did not set out to become this. The Emperor's original vision was of a secular, rational, enlightened humanity, as freed from superstition and united by the light of science and reason. He wanted to build a paradise. He wanted to lead humanity into a golden age that would last forever. And instead, through war and betrayal and the slow, corrosive passage of 10,000 years, his dream became a nightmare. The institutions he created to protect humanity became the instruments of its oppression. The truth he championed was replaced by the very superstition he sought to destroy. And the empire he built to set humanity free became the most perfect prison ever conceived. The Emperor did not want this. But the Emperor is a corpse on a throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls, and his opinion on the matter is no longer relevant. The machine he built runs on its own momentum now, too massive to steer, too ancient to change, too entrenched to dismantle. And the citizens trapped inside it have no way of knowing that things were ever different, or that they could ever be different again. That is the true horror. Not that the Imperium is cruel, but that it has forgotten that there was ever another way. Thank you so much for listening tonight. If this story moved you, or made you think, or simply helped you relax and drift off into the grim darkness of your own imagination, then I am glad. Please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Q on 40,000 if you have not already. Every subscriber, every like, and every comment helps this channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these deep dives into the darkest corners of the Warhammer universe. Leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. What aspect of the Imperium's treatment of its citizens disturbs you the most? What topics should we explore next? I read every single comment, and your suggestions often become the basis for future videos. Until next time, keep your faith strong, your laser gun charged, and your mind closed to the whispers of the warp. The Emperor protects. Though after everything we have discussed tonight, you might find yourself wondering, who protects us from the Emperor? Sleep well, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also you, listening in the dark, bearing witness to stories that deserve to be told, and that matters. That will always matter. Good night.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.